heads snapped around immediately, because when Jasmine laid out the documentation, it didn't come across like a routine oversight issue. It looked like a massive scheme operating right out in the open. By the conclusion of the hearing, every lawmaker present understood she wasn't simply pointing a finger at wrongdoing. She was outlining a roadmap. And that roadmap led to a place no one had anticipated. Before we break down exactly how, Jasmine Crockett connected the financial trails and exposed a sprawling multi-million-dollar corruption pipeline running through the Department of Homeland Security. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what follows includes cash-filled paper bags, taxpayer funds mysteriously funneled to politically tied companies, and the precise moment when a cabinet secretary realized she had walked into an ambush she couldn't escape. That morning, the House Judiciary Committee chamber carried a different weight. The atmosphere wasn't the usual mix of routine staff chatter and muted shuffling. Something in the air felt heightened. Maybe it was the unusually large number of reporters, journalists, who normally ignored these dry, predictable oversight sessions, were packed into the room as if someone had warned them a bombshell was coming. Maybe it was the sight of Kristi Noem, Trump's newly installed Secretary of Homeland Security, arriving escorted by a noticeably oversized legal team for what was billed as a basic budget hearing. Or maybe it was Jasmine Crockett herself, calmly arranging a thick binder of documents at her desk with the kind of focused anticipation trial lawyers get when they're about to reveal evidence that rewrites narratives. Secretary Noem launched into her testimony with polished confidence. She spoke fluidly about border management successes, DHS efficiency improvements, and the department's mission to protect Americans. Her delivery had the practiced smoothness of someone used to evading tough questions with elegant phrasing. And whenever she emphasized fiscal discipline and responsible budgeting, she glanced directly at the Democratic members, almost as if daring them to question her credibility. She clearly assumed this hearing would be a typical political sparring match. A few confrontational sound bites, some predictable questions, rehearsed answers, and then everyone moving on. She had no idea Crockett had been quietly assembling a case for 6 relentless weeks. The initial rounds of questioning proved predictable. Republicans offered her soft, friendly inquiries and thanked her for her service. Democrats pressed on detention standards and budget oversights. Noem glided through, occasionally consulting her lawyers, but mostly radiating control. She was playing for time, giving answers that seemed thorough but communicated nothing, a classic evasive maneuver long perfected by experienced officials. Then Jasmine Crockett got the microphone. She didn't open with fireworks. She didn't raise her voice. She began with a question that seemed bland, procedural even. Secretary Noem, can you walk this committee through the contract issued last month to Sentinel Border Solutions for detention facility technology upgrades? Specifically, I'd like the dollar amount and the procurement method. Noem blinked. It wasn't a question she expected at the start. It sounded like a staff-level detail. Congresswoman, I'd need to review the precise contract figures. DHS administers hundreds of agreements each month following standard procurement practices. It was $12.4 million. Crockett said, eyes still on her papers. Awarded under an emergency no-bid designation to Sentinel Border Solutions. Is that correct? One of Noem's attorneys quickly leaned over and whispered. Noem nodded stiffly. That sounds roughly accurate. The emergency status was due to urgent national security needs. And who owns Sentinel Border Solutions? Crockett asked in that calm, deceptively gentle tone skilled prosecutors use right before tightening the trap. Noem hesitated, barely a second, but long enough for every reporter to notice. I'm not familiar with their ownership details without further review. Let me help you, Crockett replied smoothly, lifting another page. Sentinel Border Solutions is owned by Fortress Management Group, and Fortress Management Group is controlled by a private equity pool involving several investors who are, shall we say, politically close to the current administration. She paused, then delivered the blow. In fact, one of the largest investors is a man who donated heavily to both your gubernatorial campaigns and to President Trump's campaign. Marcus Steinberg. That name ring a bell, Secretary. The tempo of the room changed. Reporters surged forward. Staffers looked up. Committee members straightened in their seats. Noem's polished expression cracked. Congresswoman, I do not involve myself in the ownership details of every company, but you do oversee which companies receive $12 million in emergency no-bid contracts, correct? Crockett countered sharply. And here's where things get interesting. Sentinel Border Solutions did not exist 2 years ago. It was formed shortly after your nomination. It has no proven expertise, no prior DHS work, no performance history, nothing except investors who happen to be your donors. She let that sink in before striking again. So explain this to the American people. How does a brand new company with zero track record receive a $12 million no-bid contract from your department? Noem inhaled, trying to recover. The procurement process adheres to the procurement process. Crockett interrupted, includes an emergency exemption that you personally authorized for a company owned by your political allies. Do you understand why that appears inappropriate? One of Noem's attorneys attempted to intervene with an objection, but Chairman Jim Jordan, recognizing the optics, allowed Crockett to proceed. Noem's composure was fading, and Crockett was only warming up. Secretary Noem, the Sentinel contract is one piece. I'd like to show you something else. She lifted a large flowchart, and instantly cameras zoomed in. This, she said clearly, is what I call a corruption map. My team and I have been tracing your department's expenditures for 6 weeks. Here's what we discovered. She didn't pause. In the 5 months since you assumed office, DHS has awarded over $78 million in contracts to companies with direct financial ties to Trump administration, officials, donors, or family associates. $78 million. The room was silent. Most of these contracts, she continued, pointing at the chart, are labeled as emergency or time-sensitive, allowing them to bypass competitive bidding. Many were issued to newly created companies with no history, and many involve services that existing contractors could have provided for significantly less. Her finger moved across the chart. Sentinel Border Solutions, $12.4 million funded by your donor. Guardian Logistics, $1 million, led by a former campaign aide. Patriot Security Systems, $15 million, majority owned by the brother-in-law of a White House advisor. She looked directly at Noem. Should I continue? Or are you noticing the trend? Noem's attorneys whispered furiously. Republicans shifted uncomfortably. Reporters typed so fast the clicking filled the chamber. And then Crockett pivoted seamlessly. But contracts aren't the only concern, are they, Secretary? Let's address your deputy, Tom H. Harmon. The name alone sent a noticeable ripple across the room. Are you aware he is under review by the Inspector General for allegedly accepting cash payments from contractors? Noem's skin visibly paled. I'm not aware of any substantiated. I have the IG summary here, Crockett said, raising another document. It details a $50,000 cash payment delivered in a day. If I delivered in a paper bag by a contractor who received a $75 million expansion approval. Only 3 weeks later, she let the tension build. The Justice Department opened a case, then abruptly closed it without explanation. Why is your deputy still employed? Noem attempted the classic deflection. I cannot discuss ongoing investigations. The investigation is closed, Secretary Crockett shot back. Closed without justification. Just like several other inquiries into misconduct inside your department since you took office. Almost as if someone is working very hard to shield politically friendly operators from accountability. She leaned in, voice sharp as a blade. You came here today to boast about fiscal responsibility. But what I have presented is a department functioning as a financial engine for politically aligned companies. No bid contracts to donors. Sudden shutdowns of corruption probes. Millions flowing without oversight. This isn't responsible governance. This is corruption designed to operate with protection from above. Publicans finally tried to interrupt, citing decorum and relevance, but Crockett pushed through. Mr. Chairman, I have one yes or no question for Secretary Noem, and the American people deserve a direct answer. Jordan hesitated, then nodded. The gentle lady may proceed. Crockett fixed her eyes on Noem, voice steady and unforgiving. Secretary Noem, have you or any member of your immediate family received any financial benefit, directly or indirectly, from companies that have received DHS contracts since you took office? Yes or no? The silence stretched. Noem looked at her attorneys. One of them whispered urgently. Finally, Noem spoke, her voice tight. I wouldn't need to review. It's a yes or no question, Secretary. Have you or your family financially benefited from companies getting DHS contracts? Noem's face was red now. My financial disclosures are all public record. That's not a yes or no answer, Crockett pressed. And the fact that you can't give a simple yes or no tells me everything I need to know. Let me help you out. Your husband's consulting firm was hired last month by Guardian Logistics, one of the companies that $8 million DHS contract to Providence Strategic Advisory Services for $200,000. That's in the public record. You're right. What's not in the public record is whether that consulting contract was discussed before or after Guardian got their DHS money. Want to clarify that for us? The room erupted. Democrats were demanding further investigation. Republicans were trying to change the subject. Reporters were shouting questions. And Noem looked like she desperately wanted to be anywhere else. But Crockett had done more revelation, and this one was designed to reframe the entire conversation. Here's what really troubles me about all this, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. For years, Republicans have talked about fiscal responsibility, about government waste, about the need to be careful stewards of taxpayer money. But what we're seeing here is the opposite of that. We're seeing a systematic loading of a federal department with contracts being handed out like party favors to political allies. She pulled out one final document. And you know what makes it even worse? While you're funneling millions to connected companies, your department is cutting funding for actual law and Border Patrol agents are reporting equipment shortages. ICE investigators are being told to deprioritize financial fraud cases. Probably. Because those cases might lead back to your contractor friends. You're literally defunding effective law enforcement to fund corruption. The funding language was deliberate and devastating. Republicans had spent years attacking Democrats with that phrase. Now Crockett was turning it around, showing how corruption within their own administration was undermining actual law enforcement. Several Republican members looked genuinely angry, not at Crockett, but at the situation she was describing. Crockett wasn't finished making her point. Secretary Noem, I want to be very clear about something. This isn't about partisan politics. This isn't about policy disagreements. This is about you using your position to benefit yourself, your family, and your political allies at taxpayer expense. This is about you creating a system where connected companies get rich with the actual work of your department's CFRs. And this is about you shutting down investigations to protect people, like Tom Heyman, who are allegedly to king cash bribes in paper bags. She held up her corruption map again. This map, if it created, it's not complete. I've only had 6 weeks and limited resources to investigate. Imagine what we'd find with full subpoena power and a proper investigation. Imagine how many more contracts we'd discover flowing to connected companies. Imagine how many more allegations of corruption have been buried. Noem tried one last time to avenge herself. Congresswoman, you're making serious allegations without what? Crockett challenged, without evidence. I have contracts with your donors' names on them. I have financial disclosures showing your family benefiting from companies getting federal money. I have Inspector General reports documenting corruptional allegations against your deputies. I have budget documents showing law enforcement operations being cut, while contractor payments explode. What more evidence do you need? The Herring Con chant for another hour, but the damage was done. No subsequent answers were defensive and evasive. She couldn't explain the pattern of no-bid Contraxto-connected companies. She couldn't justify why investigations into corruption had been closed. She couldn't address why her husband's firm had received consulting payments from federal contractors. And every time she tried to pivot to talking about border security or other accomplishments, Democrats brought the conversation back to the money trail that Crockett had exposed. By the time the hearing ended, the story had already gone viral. Crockett exposes DHS corruption network is trending on social media. News outlets were pulling the contracts Crockett had referenced and finding ever more connections she hadn't had time to mention. Government accountability shonen were calling for criminal investigations, and several Republican senators recognizing the political danger of defending obvious corruption started publicly calling for inspector general reviews. The backlash against Noem was swift and bipartisan. Within 8 hours, the Senate Oversight Committee announced they'd be launching their own investigation into DHS contract in practice. The Justice Department, facing pressure from the public exposure, reopened several cases that had been mysteriously closed, including Thom Holman bribery allegations. And Noem, who'd arrived at the hearing confident and in control, was now doing damage control interviews, trying to distance herself from companies she'd previously had no problem awarding contracts to. Crockett gave a follow-up interview that crystallized why her exposure of the corruption network mattered. What we're seeing is not just individual bad actors taking bribes or companies overcharging for services. We're seeing systematic corruption where an entire department has been turned into mechanism for enriching politicals. Contracts aren't being awarded based on who can do the job best or most efficiently. They're being awarded based on who donated to the right campaigns or heard the right family members, she continued. And here's the authoritarian TT that should concern everyone. When investigations into this corruption go upon, they get shut down. When inspectors general try to do their jobs, they face obstruction. The system that's supposed to provide accountability and prevent corruption has been corrupted. That's not just stealing taxpayer money. That's breaking the mechanisms that are supposed to stop theft. When asked about Noem's claim that the allegations were political knitted, Crockett's response was pointed. I presented contracts, financial disclosures, and investigative reps. Those are facts, not politics. If Secretary Noem thinks facts are political attacks, that tells you she can't defend the actual substance of what she's been doing. And honestly, I didn't care if she thinks this is political. The American people deserve to know when their tax money is being funneled to companies owned by a cabinet secretary's donors and benefiting her family. That's not a political issue. That's a corruption issue. 3 weeks after hearing, Tom Heyman quietly resigned, citing personal reasons, but clearly trying to get ahead of the renewed investigation into his alleged bribery. 2 of the companies Crockett had nominated her corruption map had their contracts suspended pending review, and Noem, whose political star had been rising, found herself trapped in a scandal that had effectively ended her ambitions for higher office. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing became Thor, example of what separated her from typical politicians. The willingness to do the investigative work, to follow the money trail, to build the case, and then to present it in a way that couldn't be dismissed or deflected. She hadn't just accused Noem of corruption. She'd mapped it out, shown the connections, provided the evidence, and forced everyone watching to confront an uncomfortable reality about how power was being abused. In her closing statement during a follow-up committee session, Crockett summarized what the investigation had revealed. We've learned that corruption at this level isn't accidental. It's structural. It requires systems that bypass normal oversight. It requires investigations to shut down. It requires people in positions of authority to choose enrichment over integrity. What we saw with Secretary Noem and her network wasn't a few bad apples. It was an orchard that had been planted, cultivated, and harvested for profit. And my job, our job as Congress, is to burn that orchard down and plant something better in its place. If this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett exposed a multi-million-dollar corruption network inside the Department of Homeland Security showed you why oversight matters, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives in at the moments when following the money reveals the truth. Drop a comment telling us what other agencies need this kind of scrutiny. And share this with Thanian, who believes that taxpayer money shouldn't be a slush fund for politicals. Your engagement helps us keep shining light on corruption until it can't hide anymore.